Most Americans think that this is the most democratic country in the world, but actually, it's probably the least democratic of the advanced democracies. The founding fathers never called America a democracy. They called it a republic.
Journalist and commentator Fareed Zakaria today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. Well, most Americans would probably define democracy as a form of government in which the people have their say, usually in the form of free and fair elections. And most Americans would probably agree that democracy is a better form of government than, say, a dictatorship. Well, for generations, America has tried to encourage and nurture new democracies around the world, but with only limited success. And that may be because of a fundamental misunderstanding of what a democracy is. Journalist and commentator Fareed Zakaria has long been a student of democracy and other forms of government, how they work, how they succeed, and how they often fail. In a 2003 book called The Future of Freedom, Zakaria explained why American-led democracy building around the world often does fail. Now, when he and I had this discussion, the interview you're about to hear in the spring of 2003, was more than just an academic exercise at that point, because we talked literally just days after the fall of Baghdad in Iraq during the early days of the Iraq War. In just a moment, our conversation.
Over a 30-year span, national radio personality Bill Thompson did over 10,000 interviews with people who had a hand in shaping our culture and our society. Here is one of those interviews. Enjoy.
So here now from 2003, Fareed Zakaria.
Through the 1990s, I noticed that we were all celebrating the rise of democracy around the world, elections being held everywhere. But I noticed a funny thing. If you peek back a few years afterward at these countries that had held elections, it didn't seem that nice. The country didn't seem democratic. In some sense, it didn't feel democratic to me. And I began examining that and realized that what we mean by democracy is really a combination of two things: democracy and then the institutions that produce liberty, the rule of law, independent courts, the separation of powers. And that in a whole lot of countries around the world, you were having elections, but you weren't getting any liberty.
So it would be naively insufficient to roll into a country with tanks, overthrow its dictator, pull down the statues to him, and then say to the fine people of that country, all right, hold elections. That doesn't work, does it?
It hasn't worked anywhere really in the last 3 decades. Democracy is an amazing achievement when done right. And as with anything truly rewarding, it's hard. It's hard work. It takes time to build. You can't just hold elections and walk away and say, oh, Iraq is now free. It won't be free. We know that.
So how do you achieve, this is the whole purpose of your book. How do you achieve something that is what we would call and what we would recognize as a, quote, democracy?
Well, it's interesting to look at the countries outside the Western world that didn't have the long history I describe in the world. Mm-hmm. I begin the book in 324 AD because I'm trying to explain how much background there is to Western liberty, how we got here. Separation of church and state, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment. Well, if you don't have that history, it's more difficult. But there are transitions to democracy that have taken place. If you look at East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, what is striking about those countries is they follow a version of the Western pattern. That is, they first build the institutions of liberty, the rule of law, separation of powers. Partly this happens because the dictatorships in those countries wanted to grow economically. They wanted to modernize. But it turns out once you do that, you're creating rule of law, you're creating court systems, you're creating, most importantly, a middle class that begins to petition for rights and for votes. And then you get the votes. And so democracy in that sense is the final step in a process, not the first step.
Maybe we should back up even a little bit. America is not a democracy, is it?
Most Americans think that this is the most democratic country in the world. But actually, it's probably the least democratic of the advanced democracies. If you think about it, we have a Bill of Rights that is at the heart of American democracy. And what is a Bill of Rights? It is a document that says no matter what the majority wants, you cannot abridge free speech, engage in unreasonable search and seizure, and so on. At the heart of our government, probably the most important branch is the Supreme Court. 9 unelected men and women telling you what to do. Our economy is controlled principally by an unelected Federal Reserve Bank. So we have something that is really a mixture of these what I call constitutionalism and democracy. The founding fathers never called America a democracy; they called it a republic.
Mm-hmm. We've been taught through our politicians' sound bites that democracy is the very thing that we should want.
This is something I struggled with in writing the book. I didn't want to sound like I didn't like democracy. That isn't the point of the book. But how to explain that it is a more complex phenomena, it is a more nuanced phenomena, in an atmosphere, as you say, where the celebration of democracy is so important that it seems as though you are really questioning not just motherhood and apple pie, but the entire existence of the nation.
But you make it very clear in this book that democracy goes far beyond, as you alluded to a moment ago too, goes far beyond just throwing the country open and saying, now you may elect whoever you want. It is not just a matter of having an election every now and then that makes a democracy.
One of the tragedies of the Balkans in the 1990s was that they believed naively that after communism, all you needed to do was hold elections. And they held elections, and guess what? Into that political culture, which had no preparation, no background, what stepped in was nationalism. Politicians decided we're going to campaign for votes. We need votes. And the easiest way to campaign is, guess what? Not on tax cuts, but on raw appeals to nationalism, race, ethnicity. And they produced the horrible ethnic cleansing that we saw. What people forget, much of that ethnic cleansing and genocide was fueled by elections because politicians were searching for ways to get votes. And this has happened in Africa. This has happened in other places. The most important case, of course, historically, is that of Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. Hitler's rise to power was fueled by elections. He was very popular and indeed became more and more extreme as he noticed that it was working.
It does seem kind of a cruel irony that, especially as you said in the Balkans, that they were actually kinder, gentler places to live when they were being ruled by dictators.
Certainly, it's true that in the Balkans, there was much more ethnic and religious harmony and tolerance under Tito than there has been in their democratic experience. And that is not an argument against democracy. It's just an argument that says young democracies that are in the process of building institutions tend to be very bad at dealing with these group differences because, of course, politicians are competing for votes. And so you have to be extra careful in a young democracy, which Iraq will be if it even gets to democracy, how you handle ethnic and religious differences. This is going to be very important in Iraq because Iraq is riven with ethnic and religious differences.
After this short break, Fareed Zakaria explains how the U.S. should be nurturing new democracies.
Are you finding this interview engaging? Curious about the book we're discussing?
Simply click the link in our show notes or visit our website, heardeverything.com, to get your copy.
When you shop through our affiliate links, you're not only enjoying great content, but also supporting this podcast.
Thank you for your support.
Now back to my 2003 conversation with Fareed Zakaria.
Is there a parental kind of role for the United States to play in emerging democracies?
I think the international community should play that role more than the United States specifically. I think in Iraq, as in other places, the United States should try to work with other countries so that it appears to be international assistance, not American occupation. But absolutely, you need some authority during the period that you are building these institutions. You want to have somebody governing the country, whether it's the UN or a multilateral body, I don't care. But I do think it shouldn't be any one country because that makes it very difficult to stay on. After a while, people are going to start calling it American occupation, and we won't like that. We're not an imperial power, and we're going to be appalled at that label and want to get out of there. But that's not really good for building democracy. You see, there's a tension here. To build the democracy, we need to stay. But to maintain our sense of ourselves, we're not going to want to stay if people see it as an occupation.
Well, again, the parental model, I mean, you would not put a 6-year-old on a Harley Davidson for the first time and say, okay, drive it away. Exactly. It's much too sophisticated a machinery to do that. You start the child off with a small little bicycle with training wheels, and the kid wants you to stay away because they want their independence, but it's going to take a while to get to the Harley Davidson.
Precisely. And what people misunderstand is that this is really the pattern in the West. We built these institutions very slowly. In fact, we took a lot longer than we're advocating anybody now taking. We probably took centuries. And in 1824, 5% of the American population voted. It was a slow process of broadening the franchise, opening it up, perhaps too slow, but to say that Iraq should maybe wait 2 or 3 years before holding its first election doesn't seem so long to me.
It also strikes me, and you allude to this, that we are a want-it-now culture. Let's have it instantly. If we're seeing something on, if the government falls at 2 p.m., why isn't there a democracy in place by 6?
I think one of the big problems, and one of the reasons we've had these problems, is that elections are very easy to count, to televise, to report on. They're dramatic events. They're single events. Well, how do you televise the rule of law? How do you televise the building of an independent bureaucracy? How do you televise the creation of a constitution? Much more difficult. And as a result, those issues get sidelined, and the election becomes the be-all and end-all of democratic government.
Well, indeed, how do you even measure the amount of trust and confidence that people have in their own leaders at that point? I mean, it's so intangible.
The development of civic virtue and civic culture has been at the heart of every functioning Western democracy. And that's something that, again, takes time. It doesn't happen overnight.
Maybe we just need to learn to be a little bit more patient.
We have been patient when we have been well led. It's it is a myth that Americans are not patient. They are, I'd say, instinctively impatient. But we stuck with the Cold War for decades. We are still on the banks of the Rhine. We are still in South Korea. We're still in Japan. What we need is somebody to frame the issue for us, a leader who will truly explain to us why this is not just strategically important, but politically, morally important.
And maybe leaders who can explain to us why it's important to let a country form its idea of democracy versus a carbon copy of ours.
I think that's probably the most important lesson that I come to in this book. Every country has its own set of problems, its own history, its own culture. All of them want to be democratic in some broad sense, but the varieties of democracy, the varieties of freedom are immense. I mean, if we look at the differences between American democracy and European democracy, they're vast. And who's to say that that what they have isn't right for them? What we know is what we have is right for us. It doesn't mean it's right for everybody. Freedom is something everybody wants, but a two-party system with 2 chambers and 50 states, I mean, that's an American system,
which won't work in Japan, which won't work in Great Britain, which won't work in Colombia.
Yeah, precisely.
Early on in the book, you allude to the idea of the numbers of people reading something versus our old idea of the quality of people reading something. Are the right people reading your book, do you think?
Well, I get the sense. First of all, I don't mean by that the book buying audience is so small that frankly, if everybody who were to buy or read books were to read my book, I would be just utterly delighted. I think that I wouldn't think it were a better book if it became a bestseller, but I think that my main goal is that it have an effect on the way we think about democracy, that we understand how complex it is. We understand that it's going to take time in a place like Iraq, and we need to stay the course. So yeah, my goal is not at the end of the day to sell every last copy I can. My publishers would kill me if they were to hear me say that. My goal is to change the way we think about democracy.
Fareed Zakaria is 61. He lives in New York, and you can see him on CNN and read him in the Washington Post. Now, you can get your copy of The Future of Freedom by Fareed Zakaria by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. HeardEverything.com is where you can also find my 1998 conversation with the renowned historian Eric Foner.
Our feeling that we are the preeminent exemplars of freedom comes from the American Revolution, which created a nation which declared itself to be an asylum for liberty for the whole of mankind.
And my 2012 conversation with commentator Kevin Phillips.
People have a very limited view of a lot of events because they think it all started in 1776. When you know it started 2 years earlier, you pay attention to a whole depth of what went into it and how long it took and what accomplished what.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you find podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, a delightful conversation I had back in 1991 with the famed British actor Peter Ustinov, who'd written a novel imagining what would happen if God and the devil both assumed human form in modern-day America.
Simply by virtue of being on the earth and adapting themselves to human conditions, they really become almost human, and that's the reason they have to go back. They said this is too dangerous.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.